Welcome, everyone, to the Employer Handbook Zoom Office Happy Hour. It is Friday, November 10th. My name is Eric Meyer. I am an employment lawyer at Fisher Broyles, a partner there. I am also the publisher of the Employer Handbook blog. And we're talking today about anti-Semitism in the workplace. First, I want to thank everyone for attending. And let's go through some just housekeeping measures. First, if anyone needs to use the closed captioning, it is turned on. Just go down to the bottom right-hand corner. You might need to click the More button, and then you'll see the option for captions. You can turn them on, you can hide them, but closed captioning should be on for everyone. This is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to YouTube either later today or sometime over the weekend, and I will share a link to the video either over the weekend or on Monday in a blog post or on LinkedIn or both. We also want to acknowledge that today is Veterans Day. So we want to acknowledge that our brave veterans for their sacrifice and service. Thank you very much. And folks, as I go and introduce the people around the Brady Bunch Square here, I want to remind everyone that if you want to communicate with us, well, you're muted. You're not going to be able to turn your sound on or your video on, hopefully, if I did that right, but you can use the chat feature. So please don't hesitate to chat with us, and we will try to get to all your questions, or as many as we can, and we'll do so in a way that doesn't provide any legal advice, doesn't create any attorney-client privilege. And I know we're lawyers, but just work with us here. We're not creating any sort of attorney-client privilege or giving any particular legal advice. We assume you're asking questions hypothetically on behalf of a friend. Now, let's do some introductions here. So to my immediate left, I'm not sure how it's going to show up later on, but let's hope it stays consistent, is Greg Slotnick. Greg, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you everyone for joining. I think this is going to be a very important talk, a very timely discussion. And as Eric said, we definitely look forward to the Q&A session as well. But yeah, I'm an associate with the law firm of Duane Morris, LLP, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Thanks for being here, Greg. And as you continue to go around the square, we have my friend Jonathan Segal. Jonathan, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Eric. We talked about doing something together. Sad it's on this topic, but happy we're able to offer some, hopefully some constructive ideas for those attending. Thanks for including us.
You are welcome. Thank you for being here. And finally, last but certainly not least, is my partner, Amy Epstein Gluck. Amy, it's good to see you today.
Good to see you, Eric. Thank you so much for putting this together. And thank you to our Duane Morris employment law colleagues for joining us to talk about this.
Yeah, we have a lot to fit in, folks. I have an outline in front of me that is 4 pages. There's no way we're going to get through all 4. So we will do the best we can to cover as many topics as possible. Again, please take advantage of the chat feature. At certain points during the day, as I recall, as I remember, I'll remember to do it right now before I forget. Let's see, I will put our information to connect with us on LinkedIn. So if for some reason we don't connect today, don't answer your questions, feel free to reach out with us and connect with us that way. So let's just set a baseline here, and I'll ask Amy to answer this. Maybe it's not that loaded a question. What is anti-Semitism? Is it the hatred of Jews, or is it something more than that?
So that's a really great starting point, Eric, and thanks for asking me. Anti-Semitism, it depends on who you ask, as is most things. According to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is recognized by the US, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish people or their property and community institutions and religious facilities. So that's this, very stiff definition of anti-Semitism. I think what we could also say is that it's hatred towards Jews and in the workplace that's manifested as either based on race, religion, ethnicity, or at times even genetic information.
And some examples of
Sure.
anti-Semitism that hopefully you personally have not encountered in the workplace, but we field many calls. Social media flooding our, I know my algorithm is set up right now where I'm getting tons of hits on Twitter and the like for topics, posts about anti-Semitism. What are some of the examples of anti-Semitism?
So that's a great question as well, because there are so many examples that people may not have thought of if they didn't grow up learning about Jewish history, and didn't learn about the centuries of oppression endured by Jewish people. Some examples are, the swastikas that you see, like those types of visual, pictorial symbols of hatred. Some are slogans, and some slogans can be anti-Semitic depending on the context, like this whole "from the river to the sea." It's a slogan actually calling for the eradication of Israel, Jewish people in Israel, calls for violence, making claims, that Jews killed Jesus, or drink Christian children's blood, which I've heard before. It's stereotyping of Jews with big noses and being money hungry. It's the myth about Jewish people as a conspiracy. I remember hearing one about the Jews started COVID, right? Or that Jews control the media, the economy, the banks. And the one that is really specific, which I cannot even believe that I've heard, is trivializing the Holocaust. Just the doubt that the Holocaust even occurred, and trivializing the scope and what happened to Jews during the Holocaust. Those are just a few examples. I could sit here for the entire hour and give you more, but I don't want to overshare and overstay my welcome on this.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I want to ask Jonathan something, piggybacking on what you were just talking about, Amy, and just this lack of education, right? We have people who are denying that the Holocaust even occurred. Part of what the four of us were talking about before we let people out of the waiting room is this spike of what's going on at college campuses. And that how, I think, Jonathan, your words, the epicenter really of what is going on here since October 6th. Can you speak to that a little bit, Jonathan, what you're seeing at college campuses and how that impacts the workplace? And perhaps, if I'm a three-part question, what are some of the responses if the way some students are behaving on college campuses, if that happened in the workplace, what can we do? What lessons can we take away, and what can't we do? It's a lot.
Thanks,
there.
Sarah.
Sorry.
They try to appreciate the questions. First of all, when Amy was talking about examples, and it was a great list of robust list of examples of anti-Semitic conduct, I never thought that we'd also be talking about physical violence or threatening physical violence. And we often would say or hear it starts with the words, it doesn't end with the words. We're past the words now already, and we see violence. There's a difference between civil protest and a violent assault, and we're seeing more and more of the latter. I think most people on college campuses are not engaging in this conduct, but there is a silence that is deafening by most college administrators, which is implicitly condoning it. We as society have done a good job of condemning most isms. And this doesn't apply to people on this call or this Zoom, but as a society, we need to do better in treating anti-Semitism as seriously as other isms. What we see on college campuses will go into workplaces when the kids graduate. They're not going to shed their hate at the door, and some of them are there already, and some of it probably won't be violence, but it's more likely to be some of the anti-Semitic tropes that Amy referred to, conspiratorial comments or theories about Jews. Sometimes it arises very sadly in DEI circles where we talk about equitable outcomes and complain about overrepresentation by Jews. I think in organizations, part of what we need to do is recognize that different houses are on fire at different times. The Jewish house is on fire right now, and in our education and in our training and in our corrective action, we need to look at discrimination based on someone being Jewish, which is often the Jewish peoplehood, not the religion, harassment on account of it, and then, of course, denying reasonable accommodations. What we don't do in response to anti-Semitism, engage in stereotyping or profiling of people who are not Jewish. So the people who are engaging in bad behavior are people engaging in bad behavior. We don't attribute that to anyone's ethnicity, anyone's religion, and we need to be cautious that the response not be adding one ism for another. So I appreciate the question. I try to bundle the three topics together. Thank you.
Yeah, and what's happening on college campuses is specifically terrifying because of a point you touched upon. It. These are all students who are going to become workers, and right now a lot of them have half-baked ideas about what happened. A lot of it is informed by TikTok, as Eric and I have talked about over the last 2 weeks, which is where a lot of kids get news, and that algorithm is just terrifying. And the kids don't know the language. On one college campus, my son's college campus, they were calls for an intifada. Striking.
Yeah, and just to jump in and quickly on that, Amy, and I think those points are spot on in terms of what the college campuses are seeing, and a lot of the students are really just getting all their news directly from TikTok. They're getting a snippet of what the algorithm is sort of putting in front of them, and I think that part of what employers need to do, and also on college campuses, you would hope to see more education, a deeper understanding of sort of both sides of the conflict, right, and sort of a historical perspective in terms of really knowing what you're talking about before making any particular points, and really diving headfirst into some of these protests where the rhetoric can pick up really quickly and turn from a legitimate criticism of Israel, right, and the Israeli governmental decisions, which on one hand is totally fair. It is a democracy. Israelis debate amongst themselves all the time, versus just criticizing sort of the state of Israel and everyone within it, and bundling Jews together with the actions of Israel, which is a sort of another road that it can go down quickly.
Yeah, it is possible. Two things can be true. You can be critical of the state of Israel and their policies, procedure, government, and not be anti-Semitic, right? One doesn't necessarily attach to the other. It is more when people are blaming the Jews for what is happening in Israel. When there are anti-Jewish tropes that are used in connection with criticism of Israel, that's where the anti-Semitism really becomes inflamed. We were talking a few minutes ago about education, right? And maybe people, Greg, I think you were talking about this, about people kind of speaking before knowing, right? Based on misinformation. What role or what obligation do employers have with their employees? Specifically, we have an HR audience here. Folks are very busy. They've taken an hour out of their schedule to join us. But is the onus on HR, on the company generally, to educate workers now about this issue, about anti-Semitism? And if so, is there the risk that other employees can feel disenfranchised, or, why are you so pro-Israel, right? What about me?
Yep, I think that is exactly one of the main concerns for HR and for employers generally. I do think that a lot of times when issues do arise, you'll see employees come directly to HR, which I think getting HR involved is the right measure, right? They should be involved in terms of any potential harassment, discrimination, any issues that tend to impact the workplace. I think HR is a critical component of resolving that. In terms of teaching I think part of it is maintaining open communications, and I think that one of the ways to do that is to, I think we'll talk about it in a little bit, but in terms of just creating materials, whether that's in a company handbook and a policy prohibiting discrimination, harassment at the workplace, I think anti-Semitism needs to be explicitly included as a form of harassment and discrimination. I think that you can also include sort of an ability for employees to bring concerns directly to HR as they would for any other issues on similar topics, right? And I think that resource groups, employee resource groups, are also key here in terms of inclusion for everyone. As you mentioned, you don't want to turn it into a "what about me" situation. You do want the company to be inclusive of everyone else at the same time, right? So I think open dialogues, perhaps a town hall, something of that nature, right? Or even a more embedded conversation where you do have employee resource groups. I think those are critical components in terms of making sure that everyone feels included. Whether it's an anti-Semitic trope or Islamophobia, anything of these different ideas and these different, everyone right at work has different issues in terms of protection and classifications. And I think that maintaining an HR system and policies and procedures generally across the board are critical.
Very well said. And I want to pose a question to the chat right now. Is there concern within, you don't have to out your own organization, but in your HR circles, let's say, about organizations leaning too far into politics and religion by addressing what's going on in Israel and Gaza in the workplace? So I'd like to see some responses in the chat, and maybe we'll take something from that later on. But I want to, while we're doing that, I want to ask Amy about other ways that you've seen that employers, well, I won't say proactively, I'll say more reactively, ways that they can address complaints of anti-Semitism in the workplace, successful ways.
Sure. I would treat it as Greg said, the way you treat sex discrimination, sexual harassment, race discrimination, race harassment, and all the other, issues. And I think it's really critical to include anti-Semitism when we're talking about our inclusivity trainings, our diversity trainings, our policies and our programs. It's got to be included when, we spend so much time, and me as well, right, focusing on sex discrimination and sex harassment. And there's good reason for that for sure. But we've got to include the examples so that people can recognize and then work to prevent discrimination or harassment of Jewish people. I think that the same way we add examples in our handbooks of different racist and ageist and sexist conduct and comments, I think we need to include harassment, anti-discrimination based on anti-Semitism as well. I think, employers, we're looking at such a seismic shift since COVID, and having the entire workplace, so much of our workplaces be remote, right? And everybody and their mother is online. And I think that employers really need to convey to their workforce you can post what you want, but if you're going to post anti-Semitic statements on social media and online, you could be terminated for that. And the converse is true. Like when you're talking to your colleagues, you have to be aware, that all of the anti-discrimination, anti-harassment procedures we put in place extends to social media, extends to online speech. The ADL had a great idea of installing a hotline where people can report instances of anti-Semitism and that people will investigate. You know, in terms of when somebody reports anti-Semitism, treat it the same way you treat the rest of your protected classes, which is, you know, you get a report and you immediately and thoroughly engage in an investigation, a thorough, prompt investigation, and then you take corrective action accordingly. Another idea is to add an ERG if you're with a big company that has ERGs. I think that company leaders really need to stand up and say something about anti-Semitism, because as Jonathan said, I think it was Jonathan, this is the ism du jour, right? And companies that had something to say about, you know, George Floyd, it'd be surprising to see them not say something about this, because this isn't just, this is calling for actual and serious and real violence against Jewish people. You know, the things we're seeing are terrifying and really violent. But speaking up, I think, is a major idea. And you could speak up and say you decry anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and racism and other forms of discrimination and harassment. I think all of those are important steps.
If I can just build up, thank you, Amy. If it's okay, or if I just jump in.
Go.
I think it is important, and it is a hot issue now. There is always a fear that if you deal with anti-Semitism directly, that others may feel left out. But I need to say, appropriately so, when we've dealt with sexism, when we've dealt with LGBT, when we've dealt with racism, for the most part, we haven't worried that much about the backlash. We've said it's wrong and we're going to condemn it. And I think that what we've done before is a good guide for what we should do going forward. Culture and comparators. Culturally, has an organization condemned other forms of societal wrongs, which may not have a direct nexus to the workplace? If an organization has, then the silence now will stand out. If the organization has not, then it may be a consistent practice of not getting involved in societal issues. But I don't think that silence is always complicity, but I do think silence can be problematic if it's selective. If an organization chooses to condemn anti-Semitism, organizations need to be able to say the words. And I've seen some organizations talk in so many circles to avoid offending anyone that they forgot the word anti-Semitism in their condemnation of anti-Semitism. I appreciate the effort, but you have to be able to say it, acknowledge it, to condemn it. And then I do think that even if an organization decides not to deal with this societal issue, and Amy talked about this, and so did Greg, to avoid legal liability, you want to make sure, and to have an inclusive environment under your DEI, that you at least reference what kind of behaviors are not okay in a workplace, even if they don't rise to the level of illegality. Talking about Israel, condemning terrorism, to me, there's not two sides to terrorism, full stop. There can be two sides to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And to me, that's something that employers need to think about as they navigate some complicated areas. But I don't think condemning terrorism, for me, is all that complicated.
There's a question in the chat, and I'm going to give you this one, Greg, because, well, you're going to deal with this loaded one. We get an employee who's on their personal social media, or maybe they are out, as we see a lot now, on the streets, pulling down posters of people who have been kidnapped by Hamas. So doing something, whether intentionally through their words or their actions, which could reasonably be construed as anti-Semitic. I saw on Google Alert this morning that someone in Canada, a fire deputy leader, was terminated because he liked a post comparing a health officer to Nazi. So HR gets the call, or maybe we learn about it through Twitter, because you get the you're tagged in a post. Hey, what are you going to do about this employee who was taking down posters or said this on social media? What's the protocol?
Not a loaded question at all, Eric. I think that sort of as Jonathan mentioned, right, you really need to at first get the full context. I think if it's someone, liking first, if it's someone in a health position role liking another post about, comparing somebody to a Nazi, that's one thing. If it's, talking about providing, aid to civilians, right, on either side or both sides, that's a different thing, as opposed to, like you said, tearing down posters and similar acts in that regard. I think the first step is to really get the ducks in a row first. You want to huddle up internally, and again, this goes to sort of employers taking a stand, and I think that you really do need to have a message and a communication and sort of a direction from the top down in terms of how you're going to deal with this. I think that's why leadership is really, really important in terms of, making sure that the company employees and everyone else sort of knows where you stand. And again, taking a stance against anti-Semitism should not be controversial. It's similar to taking a stance against any workplace harassment. So again, I think you look to leadership in times like this because it's really important, and you want to know sort of where you stand and what message to communicate. I do think you want to obviously have a conversation with the person. I think at certain contexts, it is important to hear their side of the story, whether that's if it's a video clip, of a shouting match, and they may make some comments. You want to get the full clip and see sort of what the whole context is. But again, if it's a one-off, or somebody's tearing down a sign, right, and leadership gives you the okay, and this is really against the values of the company, then I think you move forward with either warning or separation. And I know that this is separate and apart from sort of the PR conversation, which is a whole different area, right? And the way that social media works these days, you're ripping down a sign, your face goes up on the internet, and then bam, tens of thousands of people are liking the post, trying to find your employer, and the employer could and probably will be bombarded with messages. What are you going to do about this, on both sides, right? So I think it's critical to move quickly. I don't think you want to rest on your laurels in something like this, and stand behind sort of the decision that you end up making.
Yeah, I apropos of what you were just talking about, Greg, I saw that the EEOC had to tweet yesterday that someone who had been outed as being an EEOC employee, supposedly, was engaged in, I think it was Islamophobic behavior. And the EEOC had to post that this person doesn't work for us, isn't a contractor, you've doxed the wrong person, which is unfortunate, which happens, I imagine, a fair amount. One other thing I want to add too is, and this goes with any form of discrimination that is shared by social media or just off the clock generally, right? When the employer becomes aware of this, more often than not, it is going to have a direct impact on the workplace because someone might read that post at work, or someone might share it at work or view the video. So it could have a direct impact that way, just as if there was some sort of complaint of discrimination that happened based on an exchange or an interaction in the workplace. So there may be a legal obligation under Title VII, and at the very least under your handbook, to treat that social media post and the backlash or the reaction to it as any other complaint of discrimination that you would have to investigate. The other thing too is if you know that you have employees who are engaged in anti-Semitic behavior, I'll use that because that's what we're talking about today, and you take no action or you take insufficient action. Remember, employees might have the right to free speech, but they don't have freedom from the ramifications of their actions. If an employer doesn't take a firm enough stance or any stance at all, and that employee then comes into the workplace and repeats that behavior to a colleague or a subordinate, the employer is going to have a very difficult time defending that Title VII hostile work environment claim, potentially a disparate treatment claim, because they may lose certain defenses. One is that, like, you knew about it, but you didn't do anything about it in advance. Like, how are you going to explain that to the jury? So these are some of the things that I encourage employers to think about when they're dealing with these types of issues. Someone asked in the comments, how would you handle the kind of off the clock situation, someone tearing down a post, a sign, a posting in California or something like that? I want to caution that none of us, I don't think any of us, are licensed to practice in California, and we're not trying to give state-specific advice on off-duty conduct laws or anything like that. But that's something that employers should be mindful of. There may be certain off-duty conduct laws that come into play. There may be, not that tearing down a sign would be a form of political speech, but some states have protections for political speech outside of the workplace. So my point here is, before you take any sort of disciplinary action, involve outside counsel as part of your investigation. And if a claim arises out of this, make sure, if you had employment practices liability insurance, make sure you're putting that claim into your broker or into your carrier right away once you get that claim, so you don't lose coverage, potentially, if it does blossom into a lawsuit. Okay.
That's a great point, Eric. That's a great point on the EPL piece. And just to add to what you said in terms of not doing anything, you not only can lose some of your defenses as an employer, but you could end up being vicariously liable for what your employee is doing. And that's not a good thing.
Right. Jonathan,
Eric.
whether through religious reasons or just because of the emotional toll that what is going on overseas has taken on employees. Someone needs to, their mental health is just destroyed from what's going on overseas because they know people, they have family that live in Israel and in Gaza, right? Or they want to go to temple because they want to join a service in memory of people who have lost their lives or in support of the efforts overseas. Can you talk a little bit about the duty to provide accommodations, an employer's duty to provide accommodations?
Sure. Appreciate the question. First, on the first example of people that are distraught, even if someone is distraught because they love Hamas, if they have a psychiatric disorder, they still may be entitled to ADA and or FMLA leave. Acknowledge that pains me to say it, but we got to look at what the law says, and I don't think there would be a I'm distraught over terrorist exception. In terms of if someone says that I want to go, that my religious belief is, and it involves terrorism, I think as broadly as religious belief practices and observance is defined, that wouldn't fall within it. But if someone wants to go to their mosque, their church, their synagogue, then the question is going to be, is that time off a reasonable accommodation or an undue hardship? Before, and many of you know about, and Eric, I know, and Amy, you both have written about it, I've written about it, the Groff case, the Supreme Court had previously said if it was a de minimis, more than de minimis burden, it was too much. The Supreme Court then said, well, for 46 years, we all thought that, but that's really not what we said. What we really meant was a substantial burden. And I think what employers need to do is be more mindful that more individuals are going to be asserting accommodation claims, not assume that time off is going to be an undue hardship, make an individualized assessment. But this is, for me, always where the rubber meets the road. Make an individualized assessment for each person, not having across the board rules, but look at comparators to make sure you're not on the wrong side of it from a discrimination standpoint with regard to reasonable accommodations. So if you can let someone leave 2 hours early on Friday to go to a synagogue, then you most certainly could let someone come in probably 2 hours late because they wanted to go to their mosque. That's an area where I think discrimination with regard to race, religion, ethnicity could intersect with reasonable accommodation.
Yeah, they're very important to treat employees equally as much as you can, and also, Jonathan, to your point, being mindful of the raised standard for what constitutes an undue hardship for a religious accommodation. I mean, the way the Supreme Court left it, it's not quite as high a bar as for a disability accommodation, but it's darn close. So,
well, I also think it's more than just treating everyone equally. As Jonathan aptly said, you know, it's an individualized assessment. And then you have to balance the reasonable accommodation against discrimination standards. You know, so it may not be treating people equally, but you have to look at both. It's that comparator aspect of it.
well said. Well said. We are at 12:36. I just want to do a quick reset. That's Greg and Jonathan and Amy. I'm Eric. We're talking about anti-Semitism in the workplace. We want to thank everyone for being here. If anyone has any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. I'm going to look over there every once in a while. I see a question from Bruce Henderson, which I am going to grab right now and send to Amy because I know she has a lot to say about this. And the question from Bruce, and good to see you, Bruce, is general question. Is being Jewish covered by religion, race, or ethnicity?
It can be any of those. You know, it really can be any of those. If an employee is being discriminated against because of their religion, because of Judaism, and the Judaism they're exhibiting or their conduct as a Jewish person, that could be religion. I wrote about the case of a Louisiana case a few years ago, Bonadonna versus Louisiana College, where being Jewish was deemed it was race discrimination and ethnicity. The district court recognized that the person who had converted to Christianity could assert a claim of race discrimination under Title VII because he alleged he wasn't hired because he had Jewish blood, right? He was born Jewish. So even though he converted to Christianity at that college with that religious background, he was deemed to have Jewish blood, so it was considered race. So contextually, it really, really depends on the claim and the conduct or comments or whatever it is that are made. You know, Arab people face the same thing from an ethnic kind of perspective as Jewish people. Or people who are Muslim, you know, that people who are Muslim, that kind of brings it into religion. So it really depends on the context. I know that's our favorite employment lawyer answer. So the answer is yes, not or, it's and.
Yeah. If I could just throw one thing on, thank you, that in the educational context, Title VI, they forgot to include religion. So there's no prohibition under Title VI or Title IX on a college campus for discrimination or harassment based on religion, but there is a lot of precedent under presidents of both parties to treat it as nationality or national origin to protect Jewish employees and others from discrimination or harassment.
And under a Section 1981 claim, which covers race, if someone who is Jewish is able to claim race discrimination, well, that opens up a couple of things. One is no caps on punitive damages. Mm-hmm. There are no administrative exhaustion requirements, so you wouldn't have to go to the EEOC first. You can go right to court. And also there are many state laws that may also create avenues for employees to obtain relief that wouldn't otherwise be available under Title VII. Greg, it looked like you wanted to add something. I jumped on you. I apologize.
Not particularly. I think you said everything, but you're right in terms of that does open up different avenues under state law, and like you said, Section 1981, which is not as talked about as Title VII, but applicable specifically to race, and does kind of shortcut you into court in some ways.
I'm going to put you on the spot, though, with a question that's just been asked. For a public employer versus a private employer, and feel free, you can just give me that look like, no, don't ask it of me, but you seem like you're ready for it. What goes on, like under the umbrella of free speech, in connection with anti-Semitism, maybe it's someone pulling down posters or something like that. Are there any greater protections that you're aware of for employees of a public employer than there would be for a private employer as it relates to anti-Semitism and free speech, assuming that the two can be conjoined somehow?
Yes, I mean, in terms of a private employer, right, they're, for all intents and purposes, I mean, freedom of speech under the Constitution is not necessarily applicable, right? Because you're a private employer, and sort of the lay of the land is what is set out in your employment policies, as long as you're not violating any laws they're under. So with respect to a company that wants to make a swift decision and have a swift direction in terms of, look, if we see anybody ripping down posters, we have a zero tolerance solution, right? We're just going to fire you. That's it. That's our policy. In terms of a public employer, you may not necessarily be able to have as swift a position on things like that, right? Because you need to take into account, like you said, freedom of speech, whether that could be conceived as freedom of speech and sort of not being boxed into needing to follow, a particular employer's rules, right? But having to expand the analysis under different considerations, right? And taking things into a greater context, like you said, as opposed to just having a zero tolerance solution to that kind of a problem.
Much more of a balance under the First Amendment when you're dealing with a public employee. And your caution, Eric, I don't feel comfortable on all the First Amendment nuances for public employers personally, but I know it's much more of a balance, and it would be an additional reason, as with the off-duty conduct statutes and political protection statutes, the constitutional principles under the First Amendment or in California are an absolute. So check your lawyer.
Yeah, and I want to put that into plain English, because I too am not a constitutional attorney, because I've had this conversation. If your employees are posting, anti-Semitic things on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Slack, yes, if they're if you're a private employer, yes, you can terminate them. Can and should are two different things, but yes, you can, because they do not have a constitutional right to free speech if they work for a private employer.
Yeah, I know this only. I do very little public sector work, but I know this just because I did a recent Respect in the Workplace presentation for a public sector client, and the three boxes you generally need to check to prevail on your free speech termination claim is that, one, you're speaking as a private citizen, not as an employee. Two, is you suffered some sort of adverse employment action. And three, that, to Jonathan's point, your interests in free speech are greater than your employer's interests in running an orderly workplace. So the example I used in the presentation that I gave was when we had, several years ago, police officers in Philadelphia who were caught making all sorts of terrible posts, Islamophobic, LGBT phobic. I mean, you name it. There was a database that collected these types of public Facebook posts, and there was an investigation, and these folks were fired, and then they're suing under the First Amendment. The case went up to the Third Circuit, and I think it's back down to the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And while the case is still alive, I think it's on life support with a lot of skepticism from the judges that have looked at it already, because the question becomes, does an individual who makes these types of statements on Facebook have a greater interest in making those statements than, let's say, the Philadelphia Police Department would in ensuring that it serves the public in a way that is unbiased, not discriminatory, that kind of stuff. And I think that's a tough task for the plaintiffs to prevail on. I'll toss this out to the group, and anyone who wants to jump on this, go right ahead. Bryant is asking, what are your thoughts on addressing that support for Palestine or criticism of Israel is being perceived or interpreted as anti-Semitism or potential for bias by a complaining employee? So whoever wants to jump on that, go right ahead. Maybe I'll jump.
I think it depends on the context. Again, if someone says, and Marta, this goes to your question, if someone says, I support Hamas, that's a terrorist group. That's not a protected status. That's not a religious group. Someone can say they support Hamas, but they're going to pay the consequences for it. If someone says, I want to see greater rights for the Palestinian people, then that's protected. And not only would it be, I think, unlawful, it just would be bad employee relations and culture to take any action. Sometimes people have said, well, this could be splitting. All depends on what word you use. And the answer is yes. Words matter. How you frame it matters. And we all need to be thoughtful on what we say. When anything that begins with they or you people or etc., you're in for trouble. So I think when we're dealing with something where there can be conflation of, one issue where I don't think there, which I think it's black and white, terrorism is wrong, although the studies of people in their 25 and younger show support for Hamas, yet when you ask them about Hamas, they don't often know. So there may be an education issue. But I think we have to be really careful that we're not conflating the two. And just as we employees need to be careful, so do employers. Greg made the point, which I thought was really important. Well, this person's promoting terrorism. I had one of them, and they weren't. They were just simply saying, I don't agree with the Israeli government. That's not terrorism, and that's not discriminatory or harassing in and of itself.
And I also want to, along those lines, there's something we haven't touched upon yet, that we see this word a lot in social media, Zionism, right? We talked about anti-Semitism. We've talked about what it means to be anti-Israel, and the two could be, you can have both and not be anti-Semitic. But I want to just really talk about anti-Zionism. And this is something that comes from the Anti-Defamation League. And anti-Zionism involves rejection of Israel as a legitimate member of the community of nations and denies the rights of Jews to self-determination and to establish a state in the land of Israel, whereas Zionism itself is the movement for self-determination and statehood of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. So anti-Zionism is distinct from criticism of the policies or actions of the government of Israel, and it aligns more with anti-Semitism than being just anti-Israel per se. Here is a hypothetical question in the chat. I'm positive this is a hypothetical question. I won't say who asked it. A former employee has been commenting on posts on LinkedIn related to Islamophobia. Former employee. She still lists our company as her current employer. Others have brought these posts to our attention. Do we have any recourse, such as asking her to update her current position dates, or do we simply state that she is no longer an employee of the company? Personally, hypothetically, I would do both.
I was going to say the same thing.
I would do both.
We do that all the time.
Generally, I would, I would put out a nice post on LinkedIn that separates yourself from what she's saying, that you renounce it, that you renounce terrorism, you support Israel, whatever you need to say to distance yourself from this person, and then separately ask her, I think it was a her, Yes, her. Ask her politely at first to update her profile. And then if she doesn't update her profile, then find a lawyer. I'm sure you can find many, your outside counsel, to send a more strongly worded letter on firm letterhead. And usually that gets the point across. I find it does in my experience.
Yeah, and I think that's good practice, just generally, in terms of when you have any former employee who is still characterizing themselves as an employee of your organization. You may want to just move forward and, send out a communication, make sure that they change that if appropriate.
Amy, you were talking earlier about employee resource groups. And there was a comment, it was sent to me directly. The person mentions that they're seeing tensions arise between Muslim groups and Jewish groups. The person asked, what are the boundaries here with regards to what can take place in these groups, and where can you draw the line? For instance, the person says we're seeing a donation campaign in the Muslim group to a problematic Free Palestine type group that may, my words, that may or may not be terror affiliated. So let me take it back a step. What are some of the boundaries here with regards to these employee resource groups, and where does a line get drawn? If that makes sense.
Sure. I mean, an employee resource group is usually voluntary and led by employees, right? The stock answer really is it's going to depend. An employee resource group is normally for people who are in the same protected class or an ally, to want to go in and discuss and support each other, right? And share resources and share experiences and share problems and solutions potentially. So, I think it's like any other kind of workplace situation where you have a gathering of employees in one place. If it becomes a hostile work environment, which it very well can, just like a bunch of employees going out for happy hour can become a hostile work environment, then it certainly can become an issue where management needs to step in and draw a line. But it's going to depend on really what is being shared within that ERG and the tact that the employees who are leading the ERG are taking on it. I mean, any ERG should really explain that it's being led by the employee and it doesn't represent the views of the employer necessarily. But I think if somebody is supporting a pro-terrorist group, absolutely anyone within that ERG has the right to report it to management and HR. And HR needs to take it seriously and investigate and, figure out if it's spreading outside of the ERG and throughout the workplace. See if it's becoming a hostile work environment. Work with your lawyer, to investigate that and see if you have to do something about it.
Amy, does an employer that promotes these ERGs have a responsibility to ensure that each of these ERGs, let's say there's a Jewish support ERG, I'm just making that up, that would be open to other religions as well? Not that people have to attend, but at least open to other religions to join and participate in the ERG.
I mean, it's going to depend on the size of the workplace, and it's going to depend on the ERG situation. Like if you have an ERG based on religion, that's one thing. If you have a, Fortune 500 company and you have an LGBTQ ERG and women's ERG and a Black ERG, I think an employer always has a responsibility to understand what's going on within the ERGs, even though, they're ostensibly led by employees. I don't think an employer can stick its head in the sand and say, I don't know what's going on. And if there's an issue here, then it's really, these employees agreed to do this and they're on their own. I think that an employer, has to discuss with the founders of whatever ERG we're talking about at the very beginning and continuously what the boundaries are, where the lines are. And if there is an issue with, becomes a religious debate, I think there needs to be a conversation.
We've got about 5 minutes left. There are so many questions in the chat, and I apologize that we haven't gotten to all of them. There is one here that I wanted to pick out from Sonia here, and then what I'll do after we quickly answer this question in the last 5 minutes is I'll ask each of the panelists to offer some closing thoughts. Sonia asks, as an HR professional, what is the best way to initially respond to an employee who comes to you with concerns over being offended by another employee's free speech or personal expression on the subject? I'll take this one, actually. So the key words there are, I'm offended. I'm offended, right? So right away, I am taking that complaint seriously. Now, whether that is morphs into a complaint of discrimination, because I'm offended based on my race, my religion, in this case, national origin, etc., is a different story. But it starts with HR, and hopefully before that, a supervisor taking that complaint seriously, documenting that complaint, figuring out, what is the root of the problem here, and then, as necessary, conduct an investigation. And this is a very stock answer, and I apologize for that, but I would treat it as I would most any other complaint that potentially impacts a protected class that makes its way into human resources. And we've talked already today, and most people in this audience are familiar, and it's probably outlined in your employee handbook, how complaints of discrimination, if it comes to that, are investigated. And just because something is under the, they're saying, well, I have free speech, I can say what I want. Well, no, you don't. No, you don't. I can't use an anti-Semitic slur in the workplace under free speech, just like I couldn't call someone the N-word, just like I couldn't use sexist language or anything like that, right? Free speech ends in every private sector workplace when you walk through those doors. It's over. It's over. You got to follow the workplace rules. Okay, got about 3 minutes left. Greg, thank you so much. It's the first time we've met. Thank you so much for participating today. I really value your contributions. Is there anything else you want to add? Anything to promote? What's going on in your life?
Yeah, no, thank you, Eric, and great to meet you and Amy as well. And look, I think the fact that we had this conversation is, very important. It's also a little bit troubling. I think that these times are not necessarily going to end quickly, and I think that the considerations and things that we've talked about here today are things to move forward with, and I think continue to think through. As you mentioned previously, it's really important to speak with outside counsel if you have any questions in terms of specific situations, or you want to run any ideas by anyone. But again, I think that anti-Semitism is certainly exploding right now. It was on the rise previously. I think 2022 was the highest recorded number of anti-Semitic incidents since that statistic has been counted since 1979. So again, this was sort of an upward trajectory, unfortunately, regardless. And so you're seeing, the explosion here of more and more based on the October 7th massacre and following events. But yeah, no, I think putting these questions out there is really important. I think, again, treating these issues sort of the way that you would treat any type of discrimination and harassment, and allowing Jews to feel included in groups that are protected and shouldn't have to worry about these types of issues when they walk in the door at work. That's a place where everyone should feel included and totally protected by their employer. So I again, thank you for the opportunity to talk to everyone, and I think this was an extremely important conversation.
Jonathan, my friend, great to see you.
See
What
you
else do
too.
you have for our audience as we wrap up?
Real quickly, thank you for organizing this and including with you and Amy, Greg, and me. I'm just going to end on a very quick personal note. These are hard times. I lost three of my four grandparents lost their families in the Holocaust. So I will acknowledge I'm not always okay, particularly now. When I look at the number of people that are on this webinar or the Zoom, and I see the kind of thoughtful comments, that gives me a lot of hope. Your employees, regardless of their faith, need to see your humanity, not just the legal reactions. And if you act and say what you did here in your workplaces, it's all good. So thank you so much, really, and everyone, and the privilege of being with the three of you.
Thank you, sir. Amy, you get to wrap up.
I really echo Jonathan's sentiments. It has been shocking to me the level of anti-Semitism and the increase. It seems like everybody forgot about the terrorist attack on October 7th. The increase and the misunderstanding and misinformation and thinking that this terrorist attack was, condemning the terrorist attack is somehow political. People are killed. That may not be political. I'm horrified that we have to have this conversation. I'm horrified by the statements that are being said to people in the workplace, on campuses, and I'm heartened by the ability to be able to discuss it in such an open forum, in such a respectful way. I think employers and HR people, if you're on the call, definitely talk to your employment counsel, and, we're handling this the same way you are, and just kind of taking it as it comes while we're keeping the legal principles in mind. But to echo what Jonathan said, we want to definitely check in with our employees who are impacted by this and see if they're okay, because for sure they're not. And as I said previously, it's sometimes a very awkward, uncomfortable conversation. Call people you half know and say, hey, just want to see if you're all right. Just want to check in, see how you're doing. But that second of discomfort that you feel may be enormously gratifying for the person that you're contacting.
Well said. Well said. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank everyone who attended today, who an hour of your time. I hope it was well worth it. Again, we are recording this. I did remember to hit the record button, so I will post this to YouTube. Amy asked me if there's a way I can save the chat. I'm not sure. If anyone knows the answer to that question, just post it in the chat, and I will do my best to save it. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Again, on Veterans Day, we thank our veterans for their brave sacrifice and service, and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend. Thanks, everyone.